I think this topic comes at an extremely important time in our history, in the development of this country, particularly as we deal with transitional justice, an extremely difficult topic in the sense that a lot of Zimbabweans don't understand what it is all about, particularly those who have arrived. They have no idea why we talk of transitional justice. But those of us who haven't, we think this country has a long way to go before it becomes the sort of country that we're all proud of. We think transitional justice is the way to go. Hate speech. Let's think about Rwanda. What triggered that genocide? Let's think about the killing of 6 million Jews. Let's think about every other conflict that has occurred somewhere else. Somebody like Sipho, who has been to virtually all, well, not all, but many hotspots in the world, is probably a lot more familiar with the impact of hate speech than some of us. If you trace the conflict in Afghanistan, where Sipho has been, somebody must have said something or used their ability to communicate in a manner that triggers off anger, then violence. Who is our guest speaker today? He is an accomplished lawyer that much all of us are aware of, particularly matters that have to do with human rights and the promotion of justice. He cut his legal teeth in Zimbabwe as an attorney in some of the law firms in Zimbabwe. He also, like has happened with a lot of gifted young people, he went to Botswana, where he also practiced as a lawyer. He then went to East Timor, where he was part of an effort to transition that state from violence into a law-abiding or legal-abiding country. Sipho is currently the executive director of OSISA, which is the Open Society of Southern Africa. Has also been a senior defense trial attorney with the United Nations Serious Crimes Panel. Of all places, Sipho actually worked in Afghanistan. I've never really asked him what that was all about. Was it just the recklessness of a young man who was daring fate? Or was the anger of being a Zimbabwean and thinking Afghanistan can be worse than the torture of Zimbabwe? He then was in Oslo working for UNDP. That to me was a more civilized assignment. You know, Oslo is a lot more civilized than being in Afghanistan or East Timor. Hate speech. Zimbabwe is very unique in the sense that we are capable of using hate speech easily if you do so in our respective indigenous languages. There are things that we say in Shona or Ndebele that are unsayable in any other language. Sometimes just the crudity, the violence, the hate, and the destructive nature of some of the things that we say in our own language. They also tend to define the kind of politics that we operate in. I dare say hate speech has a lot to do with driving out of this country millions and millions of gifted young people, including people like Sipho. You ask yourself, what would this country be like if somebody like Sipho and some of his colleagues, many young men and women, plying their trade, their skills outside Zimbabwe, if they were all back in this country, applying their skills, applying their commitment, building institutions, toning down the hate speech that has become associated with our country, where would we be in our country? We probably would be way, way ahead in terms of development. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I present to you Sipho Malunga. Sipho, over to you.
Thank you so much, Baba Nyati, for this very generous, I think, presentation of my profile. I don't recognize myself. I'm really privileged to be here. So I wrote a little because I assumed that afterwards I might be asked, you know, for a copy of my lecture. I usually don't like to write lectures because then it means if I write it, I must read it. And I'm not so good at memorizing. I usually prefer to write points, but I decided to write it out because I knew that some people might miss it. I know that people might obviously watch it. It will be recorded. I want to really thank the host of this lecture, Yasin, the moderator, Tobegile, and I'm following the script that was given to me. The vice chairperson of the National Transitional Justice Working Group, Baba Paul Tembanyati, fellow Zimbabweans, those of us or those of you who joined us today, comrades and friends from elsewhere who also might have chosen to join us today. As I said, I'm profoundly grateful to the organizers for the honor and privilege of delivering this 2020 annual lecture under the theme Hate Speech and its Impact on Transitional Justice. In spite of what Baba Nyati has said, I feel scarcely qualified to do so, but I will endeavor to do justice to this really great honor that has been given to me. This is not the first time I get to speak at an event of the National Transitional Justice Working Group. I had the privilege to do so in 2018 in the vicinity of Balakwe in Matebele, Matopo, Kezi, at the annual meeting of the working group. And at the time, I was asked to speak about prospects for accountability for Kukuraundi and the Matebeleland question. I remember the topic. It was a bit long. It seems now like such a lifetime away, a lifetime in which much has happened in Zimbabwe, but also in which much seems to not have changed. And I repeat, in 2018 in December seems like such a lifetime away. If you think about it now, we are only in 2020. And a lot has happened in between, but it also feels, you get a sense that we're still stuck somewhere in the same place. I was given clear terms of reference as to what I should speak about. And of course, as I reflected, I decided to title my speech, my lecture, Hate Speech, the Trigger and Fuel of Atrocity, of Violent Atrocity. What is hate speech? One of the questions I was asked to address is the question of what it is. What is hate speech? Because we have freedom of speech. So how can freedom of speech be hate speech? So I was asked to define hate speech. And I looked everywhere. And I decided to start with the word hate itself. Of all the words in the dictionary, I hate the word hate the most. It's a strong word. It is a terrible word. To hate is to feel an intense dislike for something. Synonyms of the word are equally unnerving and include dislike, abhor, loathe, detest. Even the sound of the word is terrible. Hate has been described as an intense hostility and aversion to something, usually deriving from fear, anger, or a sense of injury or injustice. It has been described also as extreme dislike or disgust of something or someone. It's important when you are thinking about hate speech to understand and think about the meaning of the word hate. Because the word hate speech is derived from the parent, which is the word hate. So hate speech should therefore be understood in the context of the description and meaning of that word. Hate is rarely unfounded. It rarely comes from nowhere. It is usually derived from somewhere or something. It may be rooted in historical experience or in a real or unfounded fear, anger, or sense of injury or injustice. It can be generated, instigated, propagated, and encouraged. It is the drivers of hate, human and social, that must never be ignored, because it is the most intense of the most negative feelings a human being can have towards another, but also towards another thing. Hate is never a spontaneous feeling. Hate is the opposite of love. If I say, do you know love? I'm sure all of you here will say, of course, who doesn't understand and know love? Love is an intense feeling of affection. The contrast could not be more powerful. The contrast between love and hate could not be more powerful, and is captured by Martin Luther King, who said, I have decided to stick to love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. That hate is never spontaneous was aptly described by Nelson Mandela, none other than Nelson Mandela, who said that no one is born hating another because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. So that's the definition of hate. But what is the definition of hate speech? It may surprise you. It may surprise you to know that a term that we readily deploy and throw around to describe the behavior, the utterances, everyday utterances of each other, there is no universal legal definition of hate speech. There's none. The term itself is controversial. It's a controversial term, hate speech. It may again surprise you to know that hate speech legislation around the world has its origins not in the liberal post-Second World War anti-Semitic paradigm, but instead in the reactionary counter-revolutionary politics of Prussia in the 1790s. Essentially, the penalization of speech that was considered to be hateful was first used by authoritarian monarchies seeking to stem the rise of liberalism and the rise of criticism. The shift towards a human rights orientation of paradigm of hate speech occurred in the context of the pushback against anti-Semitism and the rise of liberalism and the essentialization of non-discrimination as a key value of modern-day democracies after the Second World War. However, hate speech was primarily an instrument for oppression. It was an instrument to stop the masses from being critical of the ruling elite. It was the hate speech against the ruling elite that was prohibited. The term hate speech has been described by the United Nations in its 2019 strategy and plan to address hate speech as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. In other words, based on their religion, their ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. This is often rooted in and also generates intolerance and hatred, and in certain contexts can be demeaning and divisive towards that person, group, or group. The prohibition of hate speech by international law, and I did say there is no definition, has its origins in the prohibition of discriminatory conduct, policy, and practice. The most prominent example is the United Nations condemnation of speech based on ideas or theories of superiority of one race or group of persons of one color, which is found in the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination of 1965, based on which apartheid was criminalized as a crime against humanity by the international community. So it is important to understand that it is the conduct that hate speech induces that is criminalized by international law. How, I was asked to address, how and why is hate speech so dangerous? Some people may ask, why and how is it dangerous, especially when free speech is protected? Why is some speech considered hate speech? Because if you look at the Constitution, it says I have the right to hold and express my opinion. Every constitution around the world invariably provides and guarantees that right. The Zimbabwean Constitution guarantees the right to speak freely, to receive and impart an opinion without any hindrance. Why then must free speech be censored by calling it hate speech? The simple answer is that the right to free speech, like all other rights, is that it has limitations. So rather than criminalize or prohibit hate speech, international law prohibits the incitement to discrimination, to hostility and violence, which is incitement. So it is not what you say, but it is the consequence of what you say and the intention with which you say it that is prohibited. Incitement is a very dangerous form of speech because it explicitly and deliberately aims at triggering discrimination, hostility, and violence against another person or another group. It may also lead to terrorism. It may also lead to atrocity and serious crimes. Hate speech that does not reach the threshold of incitement is not something that anybody is worried about. It's not something that international law is concerned about. It is not something that states and countries must be concerned about. It is free speech. It is important to underline that even though hate speech may not be prohibited, it may still be harmful. We only have to look at history to understand the role that hate speech has played in inciting violence and atrocity in our world. I've been asked to focus on Zimbabwe, but I will draw on three critical key international examples in addition to Zimbabwe to demonstrate the link between hate speech and violence, namely the Nazi Holocaust, the Rwandese genocide, the Kukurahundi in Zimbabwe, and more recently the xenophobic violence in South Africa. The Holocaust in Germany and Europe between 1941 and 1945 resulted in the death of over 6 million Jews. There is no doubt whatsoever, that a critical factor in the extermination of the Jews was the widespread and virulent anti-Semitic campaign, otherwise known as hate speech, in Germany and Europe, which preceded and accompanied the widespread atrocity and the killings of the Jews. The founder and publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Die Stürmer, publisher Julius Streicher, and the Nazi minister of propaganda Joseph Goebbels played a leading role in the virulent campaign advocating for the discrimination and extermination of the Jews. That virulent campaign was critical and essential to the high numbers of Jews that were killed. In Rwanda, in 1994, 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were massacred in a genocide within a space of 100 days. Hate speech propagated through a variety of media, including by senior political, religious, business, and societal leaders, played a major role in the mobilization of Hutu citizens to take up arms, mostly machetes, to hack and kill Tutsis and moderate Hutus to death. A leading radio station, RTLM, and a national newspaper was especially instrumental in advocating for violence against Tutsi citizens by identifying and publicizing their locations and directly encouraging civilians to go and massacre them, almost like a GPS. On radio, somebody would be saying, please, 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 right now there are Tutsis gathered in Makokoba. At Mkambo, there are Tutsis, there are 100 Tutsis there. We have not finished working. Please go to work. There are Tutsis there. There are cockroaches there. And this would be a rallying cry for those listening on the radio, and they would tune in every day to listen to the radio, to hear where there are Tutsis hiding, and to hear the instruction to go and kill them. So Tutsis in Rwanda were referred to as cockroaches that had to be killed. The reference itself to a human being as a cockroach is chilling. We know what we do when you see a cockroach in your house. You know, you jump. You are sitting watching TV, you see a cockroach, you jump. You get your shoe and you crush it. Because nobody likes cockroaches. Cockroaches are not allowed to live and coexist with human beings. They are not human, they are dirty, they are everything you hate. Should there be too many, you go, you bring your pesticide and you close your house and you spray them. A good cockroach is a dead cockroach. So hate speech in Rwanda was so instrumental to the killing of 800,000 Tutsis in 100 days. Can you picture that? 800,000 people were killed in 100 days, in 3 months. The scale of the killing and the pace and the rate, unheard of in history. Unheard of in history. And it would not have happened had RTLM not been broadcasting, mobilizing, encouraging, and sending and organizing Rwandese to go and kill their fellow citizens in Zimbabwe. Between 1983 and 1987, the Kukuraundi was deployed to Matabeleland and Midlands to ostensibly deal with dissidents. Instead, the 5th Brigade committed widespread atrocities against civilians, which resulted in the death of an estimated 20,000 people. It wasn't just the Kukuraundi, it was all the security agencies of the country, including the CIO, the police, and police intelligence, and also, to a great extent, Zanu-Pf youth militia. There is uncontrovertible evidence that hate speech by senior political leaders in Zimbabwe, including the Prime Minister, the Minister of Home Affairs, the Defense and Security Minister, was instrumental in encouraging the atrocities committed by a whole range of perpetrators, as I have described, including the 5th Brigade, Central Intelligence Organization, the police, and the ZANU militia. The then Prime Minister, Robert Mugabe, labeled supporters of the opposition, ZAPU, as snakes. And he labeled the leader of the party, Joshua Nkomo, as the head of the snake that needed to be crushed. You all know what you do when you see a snake. You don't pet a snake. You don't let a snake slither around in your house, not even inside or even outside. We see a snake, we get a stick. And we don't hit the snake anyway. We hit the snake on the head. You don't hit the snake not to kill it. You hit the snake to kill it. So in describing people as a snake, Mugabe and his ministers were clearly instigating speech designed to bring harm to an entire people. He labeled supporters of the opposition, as I say, the snakes. His minister, Emmerson Mnangagwa, now the president, who was then state security minister, referred to ZAPU supporters as cockroaches that had to be exterminated using DDT, which is a pesticide. Remember, I spoke about cockroaches in Rwanda. Ndebele-speaking civilians, supporters of ZAPU, were called cockroaches in Zimbabwe way before the Rwandese genocide. There was a direct correlation between the widespreadness and systematic nature of the attacks on civilians in Zimbabwe, in Matabeleland and Midlands, and the tacit encouragement, demonization, dehumanization of victims of the Kukuraundi genocide. It directly led to an increase in the numbers of people that were killed. The hate speech was critical to that. In 1990, during the election in which Zoom, Edgar Tuboy Tekere, had decided to break away, I think they fired him, they rejected him from ZANU, and he formed Zoom. Hate speech by President Mugabe and senior leaders in government and Zanu-Pf, targeting the Zimbabwe Unity Movement and the Conservative Alliance of Zimbabwe, was responsible for encouraging violent attacks against them. You may not remember this because our recent history is more memorable to us. We only think of the attacks against the MDC. But people forget that barely 3 years after the signing of the Unity Accord, the government and Zanu-Pf was on a warpath against the Zimbabwe Unity Movement. And hate speech was critical in that campaign. Mugabe warned the whites, the white community, and I quote, "If they want to rear their ugly head, their ugly terrorist and racist heads, by collaborating with Zoom, we will chop that head off." In Wange, Mugabe lamented the divisiveness of Zoom. And he said, "We are saddened that there are others who want to see us divided. But our people must not listen to small, petty little ants, which we can crush." This was describing human beings civilians, citizens of Zimbabwe who have rights, including to exercise their political and civil rights. Ants, little ants, which we can crush. We know what we do with ants when we see them. We don't like ants. We don't let ants reproduce. We kill the ants. We sweep them out of the house, or we spray them, or we hit them, or we do whatever we do. This language that Mugabe was using together with his ministers was clearly calculated as inciting violence against Zoom supporters. In the same election, you may remember, those of you who are young, who are old enough, that the Zanu-Pf campaign advertisement on television claimed that if you vote for Zoom, to vote for Zoom was like AIDS. This was in the height of the pandemic, the AIDS pandemic. We didn't have a queue then like we don't have a queue now. We didn't even have antiretrovirals. AIDS was killing people on a daily basis, inexplicably at the time. And the Zanu-Pf campaign advertisement on television claimed that a vote for Zoom like AIDS would lead to death, whereas a vote for Zanu-Pf would lead to life. It was accompanied by a motor vehicle crashing into a tree or a wall, evoking the most unfavorable emotions and fear among citizens. And this was just about a vote. In a country which had almost virtually attained a one-party state. That hate speech would accompany and encourage attacks against Zoom supporters and officials, including the attempted murder of businessman and former mayor Patrick Kombai, who was the Zoom candidate for Gweru Central, by the Central Intelligence Organization aides of his rival, Vice President Simon Muzenda of Zanu-Pf. In 2000, following the murder of white farmer David Stevens, State Security Minister Sidney Sekeramai, you may have forgotten about him because he's quiet now. He was responsible for the CIO. He would, in a hate-filled speech, immediately following the death of David Stevens, he would say, leaving no doubt that Stevens' murder was endorsed and supported at the highest level. He would say that, and I quote, the MDC have slapped a lion in the face and they will be devoured. A few days later, on the 18th of April, Independence Day, after the gruesome murder of Martin Olds at his compensation farm in Nyamandlovu, Mugabe himself would endorse that killing and reinforce the hate with hate speech, saying, and I quote, for them to be banded together with a man in opposition to government, to have gone much further in mobilizing their labor force on their farms to support the one position opposed to government has exposed them not as our friends, but as our enemies. Our present state of mind is you are now our enemies. You, because you have behaved as enemies of Zimbabwe, we are full of anger. To describe citizens of a country as enemies was clearly and undoubtedly to incite harm towards them. And harm happened. David Stevens was killed in cold blood, his body dumped on the group of other farmers that had been tortured and beaten. Martin Olds was killed in cold blood, shot dozens of times and stabbed by a group of war veterans. Nobody, none of any of the killers of Martin Stevens, of Martin Olds and David Stevens have been held to account. And there wouldn't be, because The killings were instigated. They were part of the policy. In 2000, 2002, 2005, and 2008, again, elections were accompanied by high levels of violence targeting opposition supporters of the MDC. Throughout those campaigns, Mugabe and senior Zanu-Pf leaders extensively used hate speech against MDC leaders and supporters to encourage, mobilize, justify the violence. In 2005, a day before the elections, the parliamentary elections, describing Morgan Tsvangirai, Mugabe would say, "We must know our enemy." But amongst us, you get the nutty head, Tsvangirai big-headed. You would think that the big head carries some sanity. None. That was Robert Mugabe. I should say that hate speech has not been limited to targeting the opposition. Mugabe and other Zanu-Pf leaders have used hate speech to target opponents inside Zanu-Pf, including his own vice president, Joyce Mujuru, who was labeled a witch and a prostitute. The vermin caricature would be again used to describe a rival faction of Zanu-Pf as pests that needed the pesticide Gamatox as a prelude to targeting those rivals. Hate speech would be deployed by Mugabe and his wife against his erstwhile deputy Emmerson Mnangagwa as a prelude to alleged poisoning, dismissal, and exile. After the coup, Mnangagwa would himself resort to hate speech, unsurprisingly, against his opponents in the MDC and the civil society activists, labeling them as dark forces, bad apples, and terrorists. That had to be dealt with. You can only imagine what that means. Who wants a bad apple? Who wants a dark force? Who wants a terrorist in their midst? These caricatures by Mnangagwa would be a prelude to and accompany widespread and systematic violence, abductions, and torture of civilians by state security agencies. The state and Zanu-Pf propaganda machinery would play a key role in the incitement, dismissing violence as fake and in some instances justifying it on the grounds that the victims are enemies of the state and Zanu-Pf, agents of foreign governments and regime change agents. Remember, this was the language Mugabe was using back in 1990, back in 1983. The language has not changed. The language has been consistent, and the language has consistently caused, incited, and resulted in atrocity. More recently, the Minister of Information, Monica Mtswangwa, would use ethnic slurs and hate speech to attack the Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Church and the Ndebele ethnic group in Zimbabwe, reminiscent of the times of Kukuraundi and the vitriol of Kukuraundi. The refusal by the government to apologize and withdraw the remarks would negatively affect President Mnangagwa's professed claim and effort to address the Kukuraundi. It would wipe away any modicum of goodwill and interest. It would show that the government is neither interested nor determined to address Kukuraundi or the marginalization of the Ndebele population. Hate speech is not limited to Zanu-Pf. I know you thought I would stick to Zanu-Pf only. The opposition has deployed it too. In 2018 rather, the fight over the succession of Morgan Tsvangirai between Nelson Chamisa and Togo Kupe took an ugly turn. At the funeral of Morgan Tsvangirai, hate speech was directed at Togo and a few other members who were perceived to be the rivals of Nelson Chamisa. Chanting, screaming, she was almost burned in a hut. She would then, hate-filled speech would be directed at her, sexual denigration of her as she approached the courts. She would be labeled a dissident. She would be labeled a hure, a prostitute. This was the MDC, supporters of the MDC. They would also use hate speech against the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, Priscilla Chigumba. They would again sexually denigrate her, calling her a hure. I should say that the use of hate speech to sexually denigrate women is especially prevalent across the political divide and societal spectrum in Zimbabwe, including and especially on social media. I've already mentioned the word. The most commonly used is hure, prostitute, to describe and sexually denigrate a woman. And of course, it is meant to engender and endear feelings of hostility and violence towards the women. Who wants a hure? If ever you want to say a hure is universally known. Because only women are accused of being hures. It is, of course, a product of patriarchy, but it is hate speech. In Kenya, in 2008, post-election violence would claim the lives of over 1,000 Kenyans. Most of the violence was instigated by political and civic leaders via hate speech propagated through various media, including radio. Subsequently, Joshua Arap Sang, head of the radio station CASA, would be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. I'll talk about this later. In South Africa, dating back to the early 90s, but more prominently to 2008, violent xenophobic attacks targeting foreigners have been preceded by incendiary hate speech by societal leaders. In 2008, 62 people, ironically, mostly South Africans, were killed in xenophobic attacks. In 2013, 8 South African police tied a 27-year-old Mozambican man to the back of a police van and dragged him down the road, resulting in his death from injuries sustained in the attack. 2015, attacks on foreigners in KwaZulu-Natal were attributed to comments by King Goodwill Zwelithini, who is reported to have said, and I quote, "Foreigners were changing the nature of South Africa and should be sent back." End quote. Throughout, senior South African government leaders and officials have been accused of hate speech, in which they falsely accuse foreigners of being responsible for the high crime rates in South Africa, for taking jobs, housing, and business opportunities from local South Africans. This has incited violence against foreigners. In a country which has high crime rates, which has high employment, which has low housing access, which has little and limited business opportunities, to say that a group is responsible for all that is to incite violence and hostility towards that group. You don't have to say go and kill the foreigners. You just have to say they have your jobs. For you to get your job, you know what you have to do. You don't even have to say that. Nothing captures the transnational implications of hate speech in Southern Africa and beyond than the continental impact of xenophobia. The incendiary remarks by senior government officials and the incitement has resulted in a severe continental blowback for South Africa. In 2018, the xenophobic attacks and the results resulted in the protest by many African countries and retaliations against South Africans in some countries, against South African businesses in particular, forcing President Cyril Ramaphosa to dispatch envoys to allay concerns and assure governments in the continent of the South African government's commitment to protecting foreign nationals. So hate speech knows no boundary. It cuts across national boundaries. It cuts across divides, geographies. And xenophobia is a classic example. So how does one curb hate speech? And what are the lessons from other countries? I desist to only look for lessons from other countries. I look at lessons that Zimbabwe has for other countries. There's a lot that can be learned from Zimbabwe too. The first lesson is that leadership is the first and the last line of defense against hate speech. In Zimbabwe, most hate speech has been led and driven from the very top. It was driven from the very top by Prime Minister President Mugabe, and it is led and driven from the top now by President Emerson Mnangagwa. Not 2 months ago, barely in August, he was describing citizens as dark forces, bad apples, and terrorists. If the president of a country can describe fellow citizens in that way, you know the message that it's giving to other citizens. It is a license, an open license to attack, to dehumanize, to bring violence against those dark forces, those bad apples, to throw them away. So for over 40 years, Zimbabwean leaders have curated, churned out and spewed hate speech. They are primarily responsible for the scourge of hate speech. Our leaders, our political leaders in Zanu-Pf and in the opposition, but mainly in Zanu-Pf, because Zanu-Pf has translated that speech into violence, as we saw with Kukuraundi, as we saw with the attacks against Zimbabwe Unity Movement in 1990, in 2000 against the white farmers, in 2000 against the white farmers in 2000, and the MGC, and again in 2002, and again in 2005, and again in 2008, and again in 2018, and again right now. The leaders have done so with a deliberate intention to generate intolerance in our society, to generate hatred and to divide our society along political and tribal lines, and to demean opponents and to encourage and promote violence against them. This has been the desired intention. It has not been accidental. It is not a mistake. It is not political banter. It is not political campaigning. Experiences from Rwanda and South Africa also reveal that the role of leaders is crucial in propagating hate speech and its translation into violence. There would not have been 800,000 Tutsis killed in Rwanda had RTLM not been on a daily basis from morning to night, encouraging people to go and kill other people. The lesson is that leaders who sanction hate speech encourage citizens to do the same. They encourage citizens to resort to violence against fellow citizens. The second lesson: hate speech is the first step to atrocity. It is not innocent. It is not free speech. You don't say something hateful and leave no consequence. In many cases, hate speech is the first step to genocide and crimes against humanity. In Germany, the Holocaust was aided, encouraged, and facilitated by an elaborate propaganda drive to denigrate, demean, dehumanize, and degrade the Jews. It left 6 million Jews dead. In Rwanda, the hate speech against the Tutsi was aimed at achieving the same objective. It left 800,000 Tutsis dead. In Zimbabwe, the verbal attacks against Ndebele-speaking civilians and supporters of ZAPU was similarly aimed at denigrating, demeaning, and degrading them, and encouraging attacks against them by the Kukuraundi and other security forces. That left 20,000 people dead. In South Africa, xenophobic hate speech has to date left hundreds of people dead and thousands of people displaced. The third lesson: hate speech has criminal consequences. While hate speech itself may not be a crime in every jurisdiction, its direct impact and consequence constitutes national as well as international crimes. In cases where hate speech leads to discrimination and violence, perpetrators of hate speech are criminally liable for the commission of those crimes. To this end, Julia Streicher, who was the owner, founder and publisher of Der Stürmer in Germany, in Nazi Germany, was prosecuted and found guilty of genocide by the Nuremberg Tribunal in relation to his role as founder and publisher of Der Stürmer, which led the campaign of hate speech and propaganda. His colleague, Joseph Goebbels, committed suicide. You may not know this. He was chancellor for one day after Hitler committed his own suicide in the bunker, because Hitler had put in his will that Joseph Goebbels would succeed him. Joseph Goebbels would give cyanide tablets to his 6 children, and he would take cyanide tablets himself and also kill his wife. So he escaped justice in that way by committing suicide. Had he not, he would have been tried together with Julius Streicher. Likewise, the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda found 2 media executives, Ferdinand Nahimana and Jean Bosco Barayagwiza, founders of the radio station RTLM that I spoke about, which was dubbed Radio Machete, guilty of genocide. It also found Hassan Ngeze, founder and editor of a newspaper, Kangura, guilty of genocide for spreading anti-Tutsi propaganda and Hutu superiority propaganda through his newspaper. In Kenya, in 2008, Joshua Arap Sang, radio presenter and head of operations at the Kalenjin radio station CAS FM, was indicted by the International Criminal Court on 5 charges of crimes against humanity allegedly committed against supporters of the Party of National Unity, PNU. The charges stemmed from the work he did as radio presenter of the radio station, calling for and instigating attacks against rival opposition political party supporters. Fortunately for him, of course, the charges were subsequently vacated due to lack of evidence. But he was tried by the International Criminal Court together with William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta. The 4th lesson: policy and legislative and legal responses can be an important and effective instrument in curbing hate speech. In Germany, following the Holocaust, the post-Nazi Germany enacted hate speech legislation to prevent a repeat of the atrocities. And Germany enforces that legislation very vigorously. The country has even gone further to decriminalize denialism of the Holocaust. In South Africa, the country has enacted the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act of 2000. It's called the Equality Act. South Africa is in the process of enacting the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes Act. In 2019, in the case of Kwelane versus South Africa Human Rights Commission, the Supreme Court of Appeal in South Africa held, interestingly, that the definition of hate speech was unconstitutional. The definition of hate speech in the Equality Act was unconstitutional. And that it also held that it is not enough for hate speech to simply be hurtful, as prescribed by the law, but that it must actually incite violence. This is a fascinating and interesting, controversial as well, decision. Basically, the South African Court of Appeals was simply saying that there has to be a way of drawing a line between what is free speech and what is hate speech. You can't criminalize each and everything that is unkind or that is hurtful. There's got to be an element of incitement of violence. That's a risky and fascinating proposition. Even though, of course, many people still feel that to call somebody a kefir is hate speech. But if I say, hey, kefir, I'm not saying I'm being unkind, but I'm not saying kill the kefir. But kill the Boer is a slightly different issue. Despite the fact that there's been uneven impact on the law on curbing hate speech in South Africa, this law is an important tool in the arsenal against hate speech. In Kenya, the National Cohesion and Integration Act of 2008 encourages national cohesion and criminalizes discrimination and hate speech on ethnic grounds. This despite the fact that the application of the law has been criticized as being overreaching. It has been criticized as being, you know, encouraging, it is criticized on the grounds that it incurs on free speech. I'm trying to find the words for its incursion on free speech. The last lesson I want to share is that the prevalence of hate speech in a country is essentially a reflection on the levels of tolerance, diversity, and equality in that country. The more tolerant, diverse, and equal a country is, the less prevalent hate speech is likely to be. In this regard, countries must make greater investments in building tolerant democratic societies, in addition to regulating or criminalizing hate speech. To criminalize hate speech only can easily be seen as bolting the stable after the horses have bolted out of it. Building hate speech-free societies requires nation-building programs that foster a culture of tolerance, equality, non-discrimination, and respect for diversity. It requires leaders that foster these values, not leaders that lead the charge of hate against fellow citizens. This process of building tolerant societies takes time, so it must start right away. Thank you. Ngiyabonga. Ndinotenda.
Thank you very much to our guest, Mr. Malunga. You've given us a lot to unpack and a lot to think about. I'm pretty certain we have many amongst us here who have questions and things they might want to raise. To that end, I would like to introduce everybody to our moderator, Ms. Tobekile Matimbe. She will be handling our plenary session, which unfortunately I think will keep it to 10 minutes. But I would like to hand over to you, Tobekile.
Thank you very much for handing this over. I just feel, the chill of this conversation that we're having today. And I do not want to waste more time, but, just hearing, Mr. Siphosami Malunga just, enunciate what happens, what is hate speech, and its, cataclysmic, impact on our society, it becomes most pertinent that we engage to be able to, brainstorm and rather, find ways how we can, build a society, that is peace loving. And to go to the other end, we heard about, the end of, of love and what it does. And now we analyzing hate and its impacts, hate speech and its impacts on our society. So I'm going to open it up, to those who like to, raise, critical questions or follow up, to engage with our speaker. Feel free to, when I call on you, to unmute yourself, and then, if you want, you can just briefly introduce yourself, and, please be as brief so that we have other speakers as well come in and engage with the issue of hate speech and transitional justice, especially when we're looking at our country context. So thank you. I see Tony Rila, what he wants to go for it as an icebreaker. So please, Tony, unmute yourself. If anyone else, please feel free to raise your hand. I'll see you, and I'll ask you to also come in so that we have at least 2 questions and allow Mr. Malunga to be able to respond.
Sipho, thank you. That was outstanding. And I think it's a kind of a shame that the forum itself, way back in 2006, 2007, compiled a comprehensive report, including many of the quotations that you made. Going back through all of that time, it had had no impact whatsoever. And it is the point that you make. Unless the leaders are moderate and espouse the values of peace and criticism, we will go nowhere. thank you. I really deeply appreciate your presentation. Thank you very much.
Lubekile, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Yasin. Please, may we have Bishop Raymond come through.
Thank you very much. Siyabonga, Malunga. Siyabonga, Nkosi. My question is, I'm more concerned about how we as citizens, civic society, churches, can hold our leaders accountable, make them responsible. Because by and large, African leaders are loose cannons. They are a law unto themselves. What is it that citizens can do to hold these people accountable? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've had great comments around, the profile of those who, make the utterances of hate, and we have a critical question there around accountability and how citizens can be able to hold, leaders accountable. I'll allow, our speaker to respond to those two questions, while I'll also move around the room to see who else wants to, throw in a question as follow-up. Over to you, Mr. Malunga.
Thank you so much, Tony. I did read a lot of the reports that you have produced, including on this subject, and I found them very instructive and very helpful as I was preparing. I appreciate the comments. Like you say, yes, leaders are at the heart of this. If leaders, encourage at the highest level their supporters to commit hate speech, if they commit hate speech, they literally give a license to a society that is intolerant. And the question on how do churches hold leaders, is that Reverend Motsi? The voice sounded like it was Reverend Motsi. I could be wrong, but I didn't see the video, but I heard the voice.
That's me, Malunga.
Yeah, so I know you. I can identify you with your voice now. How do we hold our leaders accountable? Now, I've already sketched out that hate speech has criminal consequences and is a crime. I've already described instances where purveyors and leaders that have used hate speech have been held accountable. And I hope that in saying this, this is a warning to our leaders that they are committing crimes. They are. The fact that they may not be held accountable right now is neither here nor there. And as you say, how can citizens hold leaders accountable? I say document it, record it. Make a record of what they're saying and doing. One day they will face justice for it. And as for the leaders, I can only say stop it. Stop committing the crime. Stop committing hate speech, because one day you will not be in power. You may not be in power. And if you are not in power, you will be held accountable for the 800,000 deaths of Tutsis. You will be held accountable for the 6 million deaths of Jews. You will be held accountable for the 20,000 deaths of Ndebele-speaking citizens. You will be held accountable for the deaths of foreign nationals in South Africa for xenophobia. It has consequences. You may evade and avoid them, but at some point in time, if you continue, you will face justice. Record it, document it as citizens, and call for justice and tell them to stop. They are your leaders. They are your political leaders. You are the ones who vote for them. And also, most importantly, as citizens, ignore them. Don't listen to them when they say to you, somebody is a cockroach. You know somebody is not a cockroach. How can somebody, by virtue of supporting a different political party, be a cockroach? You're not a cockroach, you support a different party. How can somebody be a bad apple by virtue of criticizing government, by virtue of wanting to demonstrate against poor living conditions? against hunger, against lockdowns, against violence, then you're a dark force. A dark force. I mean, who's a dark force? A citizen, a normal citizen who is trying to change their life, or a whole government that is impoverishing citizens, beating them, killing them, abducting them, and torturing them? Who's the dark force? Who's the terrorist? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I think there's someone who is unmuted and they're having a conversation. Could you kindly mute, please? Super. Back to you. You're muted, Toby.
Thank you so much, Mr. Malunga, for making that very clear, that this has to stop. It must stop. And accountability is there somewhere. It will come. It has to stop. I don't know if do we have any other questions just going across, around the room. In case I'm not seeing your hand or you are not locating your raised hand icon, please feel free, if you're in the room, to unmute yourself if you want to say anything.
My hand was up. Thank you so much, Sipho, for that comprehensive presentation, which dates back to years that we had actually forgotten about. Thank you so much. It has been so informative. And I think you have partly responded to me, because I wanted to find out if hate speech is criminalized, can be criminalized, and I think you have responded to that. And I'd like to agree with you when you said it's good to keep records, because it just reminded me of the time when Dos Santos was in power. And then when he left, because everything had been recorded, and when Johanna Lorenzo came into power, all the files were brought up, and he's having to pay him and his daughter for the damage that they caused in Angola. So I think the idea of recording is very important, because people may feel discouraged, and there's a propensity just to give up and say, oh, we are tired. But like you are saying, if we document it, a time will come. Whoever thought that the Libyan president would be out of power and late, so to speak. So I really want to support that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madrine, for that. Anyone else who wants to jump in there?
I think if we could have, if perhaps there's just one more comment, just in the interest of time.
Thank you, timekeeper. Any one last comment? Yes, Claudette, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Please go for it.
Sipho, for that really touching presentation. What really touched me was the level at which hate speech stems from, which is within ourselves, hating each other. And I just wanted to ask a question. Are we as civil society doing enough to create awareness around hate speech and its impact? Not just at that higher level, not at government level or on media and social media, but what about at the grassroots level, and how do we try to be that voice that helps people to understand that even we as citizens should not be a part of it, and learn how to recognize it as well. And I say this particularly in relation to Matabeleland right now, because we still hear a lot of tensions, between like Shona and Ndebele, etc. And if it just takes, just the wrong thing said, whether it's to do with exhumations or whatever is going to be happening in Matabeleland, then we need to make sure that people are not caught in the crossfire. Thank you, over.
Thank you so much for that. And maybe let me also add in another question there as I hand over to Mr. Malunga, to say, when we're looking at the victims themselves who are, bearing the brunt of this hate and this loaded, speech that is uttered without, restraint, how how can we, at least, foster peace within our society when we're looking at the victims themselves, those who are actually, at the, receiving end of this hate. So over to you.
Thank you so much. So it's a great question. That was two great questions. Thank you. So is civil society doing enough? It depends, right? I mean, how much programs are out there to build social cohesion, to encourage peaceful coexistence, to encourage, conflict prevention, tolerance, diversity, equality in our society? You tell me, I mean, how many organizations work on these issues? Because these are critical issues, of course, but also there have to be organizations working on documenting hate speech, calling it out, holding leaders accountable for it, recording it, and making sure that those that use it face justice and accountability. The problem, I'll tell you, is this, and this is one of my greatest regrets, and I keep saying this: Zimbabwe is a broken society. And we will continue to feel it's not going to be less, it's going to be more. The intergenerational impacts, for example, of the Kukuraundi. So you have hate speech being used by Mugabe and his ministers in Matabeleland, against Matabeleland, laced with ethnic slurs, targeting. Mugabe admitted it himself in 2018, where he said, ZAPU, the Ndebele party. You heard him when he was being interviewed. He was being asked, are you sorry about Kukuraundi? He says, yeah, I mean, it shouldn't have happened. But the Ndebele party brought arms from Tanzania, they brought arms from Russia. So you have a former president, even after being removed from power, he was unable to be even remorseful about it. He was still calling ZAPU and Ndebele party. And then you argue there was no genocide in Matabeleland. It's complete nonsense. You have people saying that the Ndebeles need to learn a lesson during the Kukuraundi. Ministers, senior ministers, Ndebeles understand, learn. Innocent Kala, yes, he was Ndebele himself, but he was part of that genocide. It doesn't mean that if you are from the same tribe, you cannot commit genocide against your own tribe. There's nothing in the law that says you can't. So now what is left behind? What is left behind is the legacy. That hate speech, the legacy of the crimes, the mass graves, the kids without birth certificates, the pain, the women who were raped, the products of rape are now some of them my age, even older. The mothers, the grandmothers that were raped are there. The fathers who were beaten and tortured are still there. So society has carried this burden forward. There's been a collectivization of guilt, a collectivization of responsibility. This is exactly what the perpetrators want. They wanted to commit these crimes, this genocide, and have the entire Shona group blamed. So now an ordinary person who's from Matabeleland, who is a victim, intergenerational victim of Kukuraundi, does not see between an ordinary fellow young Shona person a difference between that and the perpetrators of Kukuraundi, simply because that's what the perpetrators want. They want to turn the whole country into a divisive power powder keg, which is Shona and Ndebele, by failing and refusing to take responsibility for what they have done. I always argue, and I know sometimes people, some of my brothers from Matabeleland and sisters say, no, you are being too kind. I say, we know the people who committed the genocide in Matabeleland. We know them. We even have their names. But who's carrying the guilt? An entire country, an entire tribe. And this suits the perpetrators very well. So at the end of the day, we have to call the perpetrators out. We know who you are. Take responsibility for your crimes. Take responsibility for your crimes. Free everybody else. As for everybody else, do not defend a genocide you had nothing to do with. When people from Matabeleland who suffered genocide say Shonas killed us, they are right, because the people who came to kill them were Shonas. But they're not necessarily saying all Shonas killed us. So let us identify those people who came to kill the people in Matabeleland and hold them accountable. Because the same people who killed the people in Matabeleland were the same people who attacked Zoom in 1990. They're the same people who sent out the people to attack the farmers, Martin Olds, David Stevens. They're the same people who went and killed MDC opposition supporters in 2000. Same people who killed opposition supporters in 2002. Same people who killed opposition supporters in 2008. Same people 2018, and same people doing disappearances, torture, and abductions in 2020. Same people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great insights, and thought-provoking. And I think just listening to you, I get that confirmation how it's more more relevant, more pertinent, more necessary and urgent that right now hate speech is clipped, because we need to be able to foster a peace-loving society and be able to foster a good enabling environment for transitional justice. So thank you so much. And as we commemorate Human Rights Day on 10 December, may we continue to ponder on these thoughts and to ponder on the impact of our speech as we enjoy our fundamental freedoms of expression. Over to you, Yasanari.
I would like to thank everybody for joining us this morning. I would like to give an especially special thank you to our guest speaker, Mr. Malunga. Your presentation, I think I'll echo the sentiments of Tony. It's been extremely illuminating. I think you've unpacked it for everyone in a way that makes us sort of sit back, go home and think about it, particularly in regards to the insidious nature of the impact of hate speech. And having gone through it the way you've gone through it, I think for every person, it's essential that we think about how we conduct ourselves. I think, there's a fair amount of people who engage in hate speech, without having given it the thought that it deserves, in regards to the implications, the ramifications of engaging in such an activity. This goes beyond our leaders or government, just even on a personal level. So we would really, really like to thank you for that presentation. It was outstanding. I would also like to thank Tobekile for conducting our plenary session. We'd like to thank you very much for that. That was handled very well. And to Mr. Nyati, who introduced our guest speaker, we would also like to thank you. And everybody who's joined us, who's been watching, we certainly hope that this was instructive, it was illuminating, that it will encourage, discourse, discussion. And as stated by Mr. Malunga, I hope that we record, document, keep these things on record, so that when it's time to serve justice, we have these things on us. Having said that, thank you everyone for joining us for our annual lecture for 2020. We hope that you received as much as I did personally during this process. So having said that, this will conclude our lecture, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Mr. Malunga, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, super. Everyone, we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us. We wish you well.
Your views and comments are welcome on the program. Remember to like our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, and be the first to see as it happens.
Thank you.
Watching
Very,
TV
very
on the
well
go.
done.
SlyMedia TV. Building. Your views and comments are welcome on the program. Remember to like our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, and be the first to see as it happens. Watching TV on the go. SlyMedia TV. Building bridges. Your views and comments are welcome on the program. Remember to like our Facebook page and our YouTube channel and be the first to see as it happens, watching TV on the go.